The first scream tore through the street before the gunfire even started. It wasn't fear, it was the sound of someone realizing too late that trouble had already arrived. Jack Rourke didn't move. He stood dead center in the main street of Red Hollow, boots rooted in the dirt. The late afternoon sun spilling molten light over the warped storefronts. The air was heavy with heat and the kind of stillness that made every breath feel like it might be your last. But Jack's breathing was slow, steady, his eyes fixed on the shifting shapes at the far end of the street. 6 men, maybe more, their outlines jagged against the glare. The wind carried the dry scent of dust and gun oil. Somewhere, a loose sign creaked on its hinges, the sound hollow and lonely. The townsfolk had vanished minutes ago, retreating behind bolted doors and drawn curtains. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. The gang had been chasing him for 3 days, across the canyon, over the flats, through the scrub, and now they were here, in the heart of a town that wanted no part of this fight, but was about to be swallowed by it. Jack's jaw tightened. He felt the familiar weight of the Colt on his hip, the smooth curve of the grip against his palm. But he didn't draw. Not yet. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with a jagged scar from brow to cheek, his eyes pale and cold as winter steel. His name was Silas Kane, and his reputation was written in the graves of those who'd crossed him. "You've been a hard man to catch, Rourke," Kane called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "But you should have kept running." Jack's reply was calm, almost quiet, but it cut through the space between them. "I don't run from men like you." Kane's smile was thin, humorless. "Then you die like the rest." The gang spread out, boots grinding in the dust. Jack's heartbeat slowed, not quickened, the way it always did when the world narrowed to the moment before violence. He could hear the rasp of leather as hands hovered over holsters, the faint creak of spurs. And then movement. The first man lunged, drawing fast, but Jack was faster. His Colt cleared leather in a blur, the shot ringing out sharp and final. The man dropped, his body folding into the dirt. The street exploded into chaos. Gunfire ripped through the air, splinters flying from the posts beside him. Jack moved with precision, each step measured, each shot deliberate. He felt the recoil in his bones, smelled the acrid smoke curling around him. A bullet grazed his sleeve, tearing fabric, but not flesh. Another slammed into the water trough beside him, sending a spray of cold droplets into the heat. He ducked behind a wagon, breath steady, eyes scanning for the next threat. 2 of them rushed from the left. He pivoted, firing twice. One went down instantly, the other stumbled. Clutching his side before collapsing, Kane's voice cut through the chaos. "You think you can take us all, Rourke?" Jack didn't answer. He stepped out from cover, his shadow stretching long in the dying light. His gaze locked on Kane, and for a moment, the noise faded, just the 2 of them. Predator and prey, though it wasn't clear who was which. Kane drew, but Jack was already moving. The shot hit Kane's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning into the dust. The outlaw staggered back, clutching his wrist, rage twisting his face. The remaining men hesitated. Without their leader's gun, their confidence faltered. Jack advanced, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality. "This ends now." One by one, they dropped their weapons. The street fell silent again, save for the soft hiss of wind through the dry grass. Jack stood there for a long moment, the sun dipping lower, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. His chest rose and fell slowly, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving only the ache of old scars and the knowledge that peace, if it ever came, would never last. But for now, he had one dot, and in the west, sometimes that was enough. Jack Rourke walked slowly down the dusty main street of Red Hollow, the sound of his boots muffled by the thick layer of grit that clung to everything in this town. Behind him, Silas Kane was being half dragged, half carried by 2 of his surviving men, his injured hand pressed tight against his chest. The sun was sinking low, spilling molten light across the warped wooden storefronts, and the shadows stretched long and thin, like dark fingers reaching for the horizon. Jack's stride was steady, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every doorway, every window. He had won the fight, but there was no victory in his heart, only the knowledge that Kane's pale, cold stare had promised this was far from over. When Jack pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, the room fell into a hush. A few men at the tables froze mid-drink, their eyes darting to him and then away again. The air smelled of whiskey, sweat, and old wood, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. Behind the bar, Martha stood with her arms folded, her gaze fixed on him. She was a woman who had seen too many men like Jack, men who carried trouble with them like a shadow. Without a word, she poured a glass of whiskey and slid it across the counter. Jack took it, the burn of the liquor cutting through the dust in his throat. "You know he'll be back," Martha said quietly, her voice low but certain. "And next time, he won't come alone." Jack set the glass down, his fingers resting on the rim. "I know." That night, in the small room above the saloon, Jack lay on the narrow bed staring at the cracked ceiling. Sleep didn't come. It never did after a fight. The images replayed in his mind: the flash of gunfire, the smell of powder, the way Kane's men had fallen one by one. But the memories didn't stop there. They reached further back, to a time before the endless road, before the gun on his hip had become part of him. He saw the ranch where he'd grown up, the wide fields under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. His father's rough voice teaching him to ride before he could see over the saddle horn. He saw his younger brother, laughing as they raced their horses to the creek. And then he saw the fire-orange light tearing the night apart, smoke thick enough to steal the breath from his lungs, the shouts of men who came in the dark. He saw his brother lying still in the dirt, and he remembered the cold, hollow feeling that had settled in his chest the first time he pulled a trigger in anger. Silas Kane wasn't the first man to come for him, and Jack knew he wouldn't be the last. But there was something in Kane's eyes that told him this wasn't just another bounty or grudge. This was personal, and Jack didn't yet know why. 2 days later, the warning came. Jack was in the blacksmith's shop, watching the man hammer a dent out of his rifle barrel, when the door burst open and a boy no older than 12 stumbled in, panting hard. "Mr. Rourke," he gasped. "They're coming. I seen 'em riding in from the North Ridge." Jack's voice was calm, but his stomach tightened. "How many?" The boy swallowed. "More than 20. All armed." "Silas is with them." Jack nodded once, the decision already made. He stepped out into the street, the sun glaring off the dust, and began calling out to the townsfolk. "Anyone with a gun, anyone with ammunition, get to the main street now. We hold them here, or we lose everything." Faces appeared in doorways, hesitant, fearful. Some men stepped forward, rifles in hand, while others stayed hidden behind curtains. Jack didn't blame them. Not everyone was made for this kind of fight. But those who came forward, he met with a nod and a few quick words, placing them behind barrels, wagons, and the low walls that lined the street. By the time the first riders appeared on the ridge, the town was ready, or as ready as it could be. The sun was high now, the heat pressing down like a weight, and the air was so still that Jack could hear the faint jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. As Kane's men approached, they came slow, deliberate, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. Kane rode at the front, his injured hand wrapped in a strip of cloth, his eyes locked on Jack. Jack stepped into the center of the street, his Colt resting easy at his side. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, the tension wound tight as a drawn bowstring. Kane reined in his horse a few yards away, the animal's breath steaming in the heat. "You should have left when you had the chance," Kane called. Jack's voice was steady. "You should have stayed down when you had the chance." For a moment, neither man moved. Then Kane's hand twitched toward his gun, and the street erupted. The first shots cracked through the air, splinters flying from the posts and walls. Jack moved fast, firing twice and dropping the 2 men closest to him. The townsfolk joined in, their rifles barking from cover, and the street filled with smoke and shouting. Horses reared, men fell, and the dust turned dark with blood. Jack ducked behind a water trough, reloading with practiced speed, then rose to fire again. Each shot deliberate, each target chosen. Kane's men pressed hard, but the townsfolk held their ground. Jack could feel the tide turning, the attackers faltering under the unexpected resistance. Then he saw Kane, dismounting, pushing through the chaos toward him. Jack stepped out from cover, their eyes locking across the smoke-filled street. This time, there was no hesitation. Both men drew, the shots ringing out almost as one. Jack's bullet caught Kane high in the shoulder, spinning him back. Kane staggered, his gun falling from his hand. And for the first time, Jack saw something in his eyes other than cold hatred. He sought out. The remaining riders broke, turning their horses and fleeing toward the ridge. The street fell silent except for the groans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of those still standing. Jack lowered his gun, the weight of it suddenly heavy in his hand. He walked toward Kane, who was on his knees now, clutching his shoulder. "This is over," Jack said quietly. "Don't come back." Kane's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His men hauled him to his feet and led him away. Disappearing into the shimmering heat of the horizon. Jack stood in the middle of the street, the townsfolk slowly emerging from cover, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. He knew this wasn't the end, not really. Men like Kane didn't forget, and the West had a way of keeping old grudges alive. But for now, Red Hollow was safe, and for now, that was enough. The morning after the fight, Red Hollow was quieter than Jack had ever heard it. The dust still bore the marks of boot heels and hooves, dark stains where men had fallen. The townsfolk moved slowly, speaking in low voices, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the place. Jack stood on the porch of the saloon, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the street. He knew this peace wouldn't last. Men like Silas Kane didn't ride away to lick their wounds and forget. They regrouped, they planned, and they came back harder. He was thinking about leaving before Kane returned, sparing the town another fight, when he saw the rider coming in from the east. The man was hunched in the saddle, his horse lathered with sweat, and as he drew closer, Jack recognized him. Tommy Graves, a ranch hand from the counties over. Jack stepped down into the street to meet him. "Rourke," Tommy said, swinging down from the saddle, his face pale under the dust. "I've been looking for you." "It's about Kane." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Tommy glanced around, lowering his voice. "He's not just after you for the bounty. He's after you because of what happened at Dry Creek, years back. You remember a man named Eli Kane?" Jack's stomach tightened. He remembered. Eli Kane had been a rustler, mean and reckless, who'd tried to run off with a herd Jack was guarding. The fight that followed had been quick and ugly, and Eli hadn't walked away from it. Jack had never known if Eli had family until now. "Eli was Silas's brother," Tommy said. "Word is, Silas swore he'd put you in the ground himself. He's been building a crew for years, waiting for the right time." Jack let the words settle. It explained the look in Kane's eyes, the way this fight had felt different from all the others. This wasn't business. This was blood. Tommy shifted uneasily. "He's holed up in Black Mesa now. Got near 30 men with him, maybe more. If you wait for him to come here, Red Hollow won't stand a chance." Jack looked down the street, at the people going about their day, trying to pretend the danger had passed. He thought of Martha behind the bar, of the boy who'd run to warn him, of the men who'd stood beside him in the fight. If Kane came back here, the town would burn. He made his decision. "Then I won't wait." By nightfall, Jack had packed what little he owned as spare shirt, a box of cartridges, a coil of rope. He saddled his horse, a rangy bay with more scars than shine, and slipped out of town without fanfare. The fewer people who knew where he was going, the better. The land between Red Hollow and Black Mesa was rough country, dry washes that could swallow a horse, jagged ridges that cut the sky into shards. Jack rode hard, sleeping in short snatches under the stars, his mind turning over the past. He remembered Eli Kane's face, the way the man had laughed when he thought he had the upper hand, the shock in his eyes when he realized he didn't. Jack had never killed for pleasure, but he'd learned long ago that in the West, hesitation could get you buried. On the third day, he reached the edge of Black Mesa. The land rose in steep, flat-topped cliffs, the rock dark against the pale sky. Somewhere up there, Kane and his men were waiting. Jack found a narrow trail and led his horse up, moving slow, every sense alert. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke campfires. He was close. He left the horse in a sheltered hollow and went on foot, Colt in hand. The camp came into view suddenly, a cluster of tents and bedrolls around a central fire. Men lounged with rifles across their knees, talking in low voices. Jack counted at least a dozen in sight, which meant there were more he couldn't see. He spotted Kane near the fire, his arm in a sling, his face lit by the flames. The man was smiling, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind that promised bad things. Jack knew he couldn't take them all head-on. He'd have to be smart. Circling wide, he found a vantage point above the camp, a ledge where he could see without being seen. He waited, watching, learning the rhythm of the place, the way the guards shifted, the moments when the firelight flared and shadows deepened. He thought about what Tommy had said, about Kane building this crew for years. If he could break them here, now, maybe the manhunt would end. But as he watched, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Kane wasn't just talking to his men, he was showing them a map. And on that map, Jack recognized the outline of Red Hollow. Kane wasn't planning to come for him alone. He was planning to wipe the town off the map. Jack eased back from the ledge, his mind racing. He had to get back to Red Hollow before Kane moved. But as he turned, a boot scraped on rock behind him. He spun, Colt raised, and found himself staring into the barrel of another gun. The man holding it was tall, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Well, he drawled. Looks like we caught ourselves a spy. Jack didn't answer. He was already calculating distance, angle, the weight of the trigger under his finger. He knew one thing for certain: if he didn't get out of here now, Kane's war would start without him, and Red Hollow would never see him ride back. The man's grin widened as he pressed the barrel closer to Jack's chest. The firelight from the camp below flickered against the rock, throwing jagged shadows across his face. Jack could hear voices drifting up from Kane's men, the low rumble of laughter, the clink of bottles. They didn't know yet that he was here. That was the only advantage he had. Jack's eyes flicked to the man's stance, weight on his back foot, gun hand steady but not tight. He was confident, maybe too confident. Jack let his shoulders sag, feigning resignation. And in that fraction of a second when the man's guard dipped, he moved. His left hand shot up, knocking the barrel aside as his right brought the Colt up from his hip. The shot was muffled by the rock walls, but the man's grunt was sharp and final. He crumpled without a sound. Jack caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to keep the noise down. He dragged the body into the shadows, heart pounding but breath steady. Below, the campfire still burned. The men still laughed. Kane was leaning over the map again, tracing a line toward Red Hollow with his good hand. Jack knew he couldn't take them all here, not without dying for it, but he could slow them down. He moved along the ridge, eyes scanning for anything he could use. A stack of crates set near the edge of the camp, close enough to the fire that the wood was dry as tinder. Jack pulled a small flask from his coat, splashing the last of his whiskey over the nearest crate. Then he struck a match. The flame caught instantly, racing along the grain, and within seconds the fire was roaring. Shouts erupted below. Men scrambled for buckets. Others grabbed rifles, scanning the darkness. Jack used the chaos to slip back toward the trail, moving fast but careful. A shot cracked past his ear. Someone had spotted him. He dove behind a boulder, returning fire, the muzzle flash lighting the rock face for an instant. Another shot, another, and then he was running, boots skidding on loose gravel as he descended toward where he'd left his horse. The bay was restless, ears flicking at the noise from above, but Jack swung into the saddle in one smooth motion. He kicked hard, and the horse lunged forward, hooves striking sparks on the stone. Behind him, voices rose in anger, and more gunfire echoed through the mesa. A bullet tore past his leg, another whined overhead. But the darkness swallowed him as he plunged into the narrow canyon. He didn't stop riding until the first light of dawn touched the horizon. The horse's flanks were lathered, its breath coming in harsh bursts. But Jack didn't slow until he was sure no one was behind him. He slid from the saddle, letting the animal drink from a shallow stream, and crouched to catch his own breath. His mind was already turning over the next move. Kane would regroup fast. The fire might have destroyed some supplies, but it wouldn't stop him. If anything, it would make him come harder, angrier. Jack mounted again, pushing the bay into a steady lope. Every mile between him and Red Hollow felt like a race against a clock he couldn't see. He thought of the boy who'd warned him, of Martha behind the bar, of the men who'd stood with him in the street. If Kane reached them before he did, there'd be no defense strong enough to hold that by midday. The heat was rising, the air shimmering over the flats. Jack's shirt clung to his back, dust caked in the lines of his face. He kept his eyes on the horizon, willing the familiar outline of Red Hollow to appear. When it finally did, a small smudge against the pale sky, he urged the horse faster. He rode straight into the main street, pulling up hard in front of the saloon. People turned at the sound, their faces shifting from surprise to concern as they saw him. Jack swung down, his voice carrying over the quiet. "Kane's coming," he said, "and he's bringing everyone he's got." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men stepped forward, others backed away. Jack looked at each of them in turn. "We've got hours, maybe less. If you want to live, you'll fight. If you can't fight, get your families out now." Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. "What's the plan?" Jack glanced down the street, already picturing the barricades, the firing lines, the places where they could make a stand. "We make this town a wall," he said, "and we don't let them through." The sun was already sliding west, the shadows stretching long again. Somewhere out there, Kane was riding hard, the dust of his army rising behind him. Jack felt the weight of the colt at his side, the ache in his muscles, the burn in his lungs. He knew the fight ahead would be worse than anything yet. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't running. Not now, not ever. By the time the sun dipped low, Red Hollow had transformed. Wagons were overturned across the main street, barrels rolled into place, windows boarded up. Men with rifles crouched behind cover, their faces set in grim determination. Women and children had been sent toward the hills under the protection of a few riders, their silhouettes already fading into the distance. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of anticipation. Jack moved among the defenders, checking weapons, offering a word here, a nod there. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the town seemed to hold its breath. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind felt like it might be the start. Then they heard it, the low, steady thunder of hooves. Dust rose on the horizon, a dark smear against the fading light. Kane's riders came into view, spread wide across the flats, the setting sun glinting off rifle barrels. At their head rode Silas Kane, his arm still in a sling, his face a mask of cold fury. Jack stepped into the center of the street, Colt at his side, and waited. The riders slowed as they approached, fanning out to encircle the town. Kane reined in just beyond shouting distance, his pale eyes locked on Jack. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Kane raised his good hand and dropped it. The street exploded. Gunfire cracked from both sides, the sharp reports echoing off the buildings. Splinters flew from the saloon's facade, glass shattered, and the air filled with the acrid bite of powder smoke. Jack fired twice, dropping a rider who'd broken from the line, then ducked behind a barrel as bullets chewed into the wood. The defenders held their ground, returning fire in measured bursts. Jack moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. He saw Kane's men trying to flank along the alleyways, and he shouted warnings, shifting men to cover the gaps. A sudden scream cut through the chaos. A young man, barely more than a boy, clutching his leg as blood pooled beneath him. Jack was there in seconds, dragging him to safety behind a wagon. "Stay down," he said, pressing a strip of cloth to the wound before grabbing the boy's rifle and stepping back into the fight. The battle surged and ebbed, the street a blur of smoke, shouting, and the dull thud of bullets hitting wood and flesh. Jack's world narrowed to the rhythm of firing and reloading, the weight of the Colt in his hand, the heat of the barrel. Then he saw Kane. The outlaw had dismounted, moving through the chaos with a predator's focus, his eyes never leaving Jack. It was as if the rest of the fight didn't exist, only the two of them, drawn together by years of blood and unfinished business. Jack stepped out from cover, their gazes locking across the churned-up street. The noise seemed to fade, the world shrinking to the space between them. Kane's hand hovered over his gun, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile. They drew at the same instant. Jack's shot hit first, slamming into Kane's shoulder and spinning him sideways. Kane fired as he fell, the bullet grazing Jack's ribs, hot pain flaring along his side. Jack advanced, ignoring the burn, his Colt steady. Kane was on his knees now, blood soaking his shirt, his gun lying in the dust. "This is where it ends," Jack said, his voice low but carrying. Kane's pale eyes met his. still defiant even as the strength drained from him. "You think killing me will change anything?" he rasped. Jack shook his head. "No, but it'll stop you." The final shot was quick, clean. Kane fell back, the light fading from his eyes. Around them, the fight was ending. Kane's men breaking, fleeing into the gathering dark. The defenders of Red Hollow stood slowly, the realization of victory settling over them like a heavy blanket. Jack holstered his Colt, the weight of it suddenly immense. He looked around at the battered street, the wounded being tended, the faces of those who had stood their ground. The town was still standing. For now, that was enough. As the first stars appeared overhead, Jack walked to the edge of town, the cool night air washing over him. He knew the West would never truly be safe, that there would always be another fight, another enemy. But tonight, Red Hollow was his, and he wasn't running. Not now, not ever. The night air in Red Hollow was cool, but the street still smelled of smoke and blood. Lanterns swung from porches, casting restless shadows over the battered facades. Jack stood in the middle of it all, ribs aching where Kane's bullet had grazed him, watching the last of the wounded being carried inside. The townsfolk moved with a strange mix of relief and unease. They'd survived, but the cost was written in the faces of the men who wouldn't see another sunrise. Martha came to stand beside him, her hands on her hips, eyes scanning the street. "You should get that looked at," she said, nodding toward the dark stain on his shirt. Jack shook his head. Later, his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the darkness seemed thicker than it should be. "This isn't over," she frowned. "Kane's dead. His men scattered, some scattered," Jack said quietly. "Not all," as if to prove him right. A rider appeared at the far end of the street, galloping hard. The horse was lathered, its flanks streaked with foam, and the man in the saddle was slumped forward, barely holding on. Jack stepped forward as the rider pulled up, nearly falling from the saddle. "They're regrouping." The man gasped. "Not far from here. Kane's second, a man named Cutter. He's taking charge. Says they'll burn the town before dawn." The words hit like a hammer. Jack had heard of Cutter, a brutal enforcer with no loyalty except to the highest bidder. If he'd taken command, the fight they'd just survived was only the opening round. Jack turned to Martha. "Get everyone who can still hold a gun. We don't have long." Within minutes, the street was alive again with movement. Men reloaded rifles, women filled buckets from the well in case of fire, and the few horses left in town were saddled for quick strikes. Jack moved among them, giving quiet instructions, his mind already mapping the terrain beyond the edge of town. He knew Cutter wouldn't come straight down the main street. He'd circle, hit from the dark, maybe set the buildings alight to drive people into the open. Jack would have to meet him before he reached the town, cut him off in the scrubland where the moonlight barely touched the ground. By the time the first stars were high, Jack was riding out with a small group of the town's best shots. The night was silent except for the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. Every shadow seemed to shift, every gust of wind carried the whisper of danger. They found Cutter's men less than 2 miles out, camped in a shallow draw, their fire banked low. Jack counted at least a dozen shapes moving in the gloom, the glint of steel catching the starlight. Cutter himself stood apart, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a long coat and a rifle slung across his back. Jack felt the old, familiar calm settle over him. The fight in Red Hollow had been about survival. This one would be about ending the threat before it reached the town again. He dismounted, signaling the others to spread out. The dry grass whispered under his boots as he moved closer, the Colt warm against his palm. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote yipped, and Cutter's head turned slightly, his eyes scanning the night. Jack kept moving. The night was so still Jack could hear the faint rasp of his own breath. The dry grass brushed against his boots as he crept closer, the Colt heavy but steady in his hand. Down in the shallow draw, Cutter's men moved like shadows round the low fire, their voices a low murmur carried on the wind. The flames were banked, throwing more darkness than light. But every now and then a face caught the glow, hard faces. Men who'd seen too much and cared too little. Cutter stood apart, his long coat shifting in the breeze, the rifle slung across his back catching a glint of starlight. He was taller than Jack remembered from the stories, broad through the shoulders, his stance loose but coiled, like a man who could explode into violence without warning. Jack studied him, memorizing the way he moved, the way his head turned slightly when the coyote's cry echoed again from the ridge. Jack signaled with 2 fingers, and the men from Red Hollow began to fan out, melting into the scrub. They were good shots, but they weren't soldiers. If this turned into a straight fight, the numbers would crush them. The only chance was to hit hard, fast, and scatter the gang before they could form up. He eased forward another few yards, the scent of wood smoke and sweat drifting up from the camp. A man on the edge of the firelight shifted, turning his back to Jack, and that was all the opening he needed. He moved in a low crouch, closing the distance until he could see the stitching on the man's coat. The Colt came up, the hammer cocked with a soft click that seemed deafening in the stillness. The first shot was a whisper compared to the roar that followed. The man dropped without a sound, but the camp erupted, shouts, the scrape of boots, the metallic snap of rifles being brought to bear. Jack fired again, then dove behind a boulder as bullets tore through the grass where he'd been standing. From the ridge, the Red Hollow men opened up, their shots cracking in the night. Sparks leapt from the rocks, and one of Cutter's men went down hard, his rifle spinning away into the dust. The gang scrambled for cover, some firing blindly into the dark, others trying to mount their horses. Jack moved along the boulder's edge, firing in short, controlled bursts. He saw Cutter now, moving through the chaos with that same predator's focus, barking orders that cut through the noise. The man didn't flinch when a bullet chewed the dirt at his feet. He just kept coming. Eyes locked on the ridge where Jack's men were firing. Jack knew he had to draw him out. He broke from cover, sprinting toward the far side of the draw, firing as he ran. Cutter's head snapped toward him, and Jack saw the moment the man decided. The rifle came off his back in one smooth motion, and the crack of the shot was like a hammer in the night. The bullet missed by inches, splintering a rock beside Jack's head. He dove into a shallow wash, the cold grit biting into his palms, and rolled to his feet. Cutter was advancing now, using the chaos as cover, his men rallying around him. Jack fired twice, forcing him to duck behind a fallen log, then glanced toward the ridge. His men were holding, but barely. The gang was pushing back, their numbers starting to tell. A horse screamed somewhere in the dark, and Jack knew they were running out of time. If Cutter broke through here, the road to Red Hollow would be wide open. He slid a fresh cartridge into the Colt, the motion automatic, and began to circle left, keeping low. The firelight flickered over Cutter's face as the man rose from behind the log, scanning for him. Jack's boots found a patch of loose gravel, and the crunch was enough. Cutter's head snapped around, and their eyes met across the dark. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Cutter smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of the mouth, and started toward him. Jack tightened his grip on the Colt, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't the showdown in Red Hollow, with the whole town watching. This was something quieter, meaner, and far from over, somewhere behind him. One of the Red Hollow men shouted his name, but Jack didn't look back. His focus was on the tall figure closing the distance, the glint of steel in the man's hand, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would decide more than just this fight. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust and blood, and Jack stepped forward to meet him. The wind carried the smell of dust and blood, and Jack stepped forward to meet Cutter. The man's boots crunched softly on the dry earth, each step deliberate. His eyes locked on Jack's like a predator closing in. Around them, the fight still raged in bursts, the crack of rifles from the ridge, the shouts of men in the dark. But here, in the narrow space between them, the noise seemed to fade into a low, distant roar. Cutter's knife caught the starlight as he drew it from his belt, the blade long and narrow, meant for quick work. Jack kept the Colt steady, but he didn't fire, not yet. He wanted Cutter close enough to see the truth in his eyes when this ended. Whatever ending meant tonight, they circled each other slowly, boots whispering in the dust. Cutter's grin was thin, humorless. "You've been a thorn in Kane's side for years," he said, his voice low and even. "Now he's gone, and I get the pleasure of pulling you out by the roots." Jack's reply was just as quiet. "You'll have to dig deep." Cutter moved first, fast for a man his size, closing the distance in a heartbeat. Jack sidestepped, the Colt coming up, but Cutter's shoulder slammed into him before he could fire. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, and they went down hard in the dirt. The gun skittering away into the shadows, the knife flashed again, and Jack caught Cutter's wrist. The two of them locked in a brutal struggle. The smell of sweat and iron filled the air as they rolled, each trying to get the upper hand. Cutter's strength was raw, unyielding, but Jack had fought enough men like him to know that strength alone didn't win fights. He twisted, using Cutter's momentum to throw him off, then scrambled to his feet. Cutter was up just as fast, the knife still in his hand, his grin wider now. "You fight like a man who's got something to lose," he said. Jack didn't answer. He lunged, catching Cutter's arm and driving his fist into the man's ribs. Cutter grunted but didn't drop the knife. They traded blows in the dark, the sounds of the larger battle fading in and out like waves on a distant shore. Somewhere behind them, a rifle cracked and a bullet hissed past Jack's ear. He didn't know if it was meant for him or Cutter, and he didn't care. The fight had narrowed to this, to men, one patch of dirt, and the knowledge that only one would walk away. Cutter feinted left, then came in low, the knife slicing a shallow line across Jack's side. Pain flared hot, but Jack used it, driving his knee into Cutter's gut and forcing him back a step. He saw the opening then, small, fleeting, and went for it, grabbing Cutter's wrist and twisting hard. The knife clattered to the ground before Jack could press the advantage. A shout rang out from the ridge. "They're falling back." Cutter's eyes flicked toward the sound, and Jack felt the shift in him, not fear, but calculation. The man wasn't beaten, not yet. He shoved Jack hard, sending him stumbling, then turned and melted into the chaos, disappearing into the dark like smoke on the wind. Jack stood there for a moment, chest heaving, the taste of blood in his mouth. He could still hear the retreating hoof beats of Cutter's men, the ragged calls of the Red Hollow defenders regrouping. The fight here was over, but the war was far from done. He retrieved his Colt from the dirt, sliding it back into its holster, and scanned the darkness where Cutter had vanished. The man would be back. Jack knew it as surely as he knew the sun would rise. And next time, Cutter wouldn't come alone. The night closed in around him, the stars cold and sharp overhead. Somewhere out there, in the vast, empty miles of the west, Cutter was already planning his next move. And Jack Rourke, bruised, bleeding, and unshaken, was ready to meet him when he did. The night pressed in around Jack like a living thing, the stars cold and sharp above the jagged horizon. The hoofbeats of Cutter's retreating men had faded, but the echo of them still throbbed in his ears. He knew the man wouldn't run far. Cutter was too proud, too stubborn to vanish without striking back. That meant he'd be somewhere close, licking his wounds and planning the next move. Jack holstered the Colt and moved back toward the ridge where the Red Hollow men were gathering. Faces emerged from the dark, tired, dust-streaked, eyes wide from the fight. Some were grinning in relief, others staring into the night as if expecting it to spit out more enemies at any moment. "He got away," one of them said, voice tight. Jack nodded once. Not for long. They wanted to ride after him right then, but Jack shook his head. "We go now. We ride into an ambush. He knows this land. We wait until first light, then we track him." The hours until dawn were long and restless. Jack sat apart from the others, cleaning his Colt by the dying glow of the fire, his mind turning over every detail of the fight. Cutter's strength, his speed, the way he'd smiled even when the knife was not from his hand. It all told Jack one thing: this man wasn't just another hired gun. He was dangerous in a way that went beyond skill. He enjoyed the hunt. When the first pale light touched the eastern sky, Jack was already in the saddle. The air was cool, the ground still holding the night's chill. They found Cutter's trail easily, deep hoofprints in the soft earth, a broken branch here, a scuff of boot leather there. He wasn't hiding his path. That was deliberate. By mid-morning, the trail led them into a narrow canyon, the walls rising steep and close on either side. Jack slowed his horse, scanning the ridges above. The silence here was wrong, too complete, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A stone clattered down from somewhere high, bouncing off the canyon wall. Jack's hand went to his gun. "Eyes up," he called softly. The first shot came from the left ridge, the crack echoing like thunder in the confined space. One of the riders behind Jack cried out, his horse rearing. More shots followed, the sound ricocheting off the stone until it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. Off the horses, Jack shouted. They scrambled for cover, pressing against the canyon walls as dust and stone chips rained down. Jack fired toward a flash of movement on the ridge, but the shooter was gone before the bullets struck Dot. It was a textbook ambush, Cutter's style all over it. He wasn't trying to kill them all here. He was testing them, bleeding them, making them think twice about following. When the gunfire stopped, the canyon was thick with the smell of powder and the sharp tang of fear. Jack counted his men, 1 down, 2 wounded. Cutter had made his point, but Jack wasn't turning back. They moved on foot now, leading the horses through the winding canyon until it opened into a wide basin. The sun was high, the heat pressing down, and in the distance, a thin column of smoke curled into the sky. Jack studied it for a long moment. "That's him," he said. The others looked uneasy. "Could be a trap," one muttered. "It is a trap," Jack said. "But it's also our only chance." They moved toward the smoke, every step measured, every sound amplified in the stillness. The basin floor was littered with boulders and scrub, perfect for concealment. Jack's eyes never stopped moving, searching for the flicker of movement, the glint of steel. When they crested the last rise, they saw it. A small camp, a single fire, and Cutter sitting beside it, sharpening a long knife. He looked up as they appeared, and that slow, dangerous smile spread across his face again. "I was wondering when you'd catch up," he called. Jack didn't answer. He stepped forward, the Colt loose in his hand, the heat shimmering between them. The men behind him shifted, waiting for his signal. Cutter rose to his feet, the knife gleaming in the sun. "Let's finish what we started." The air between them seemed to tighten, the world narrowing to the space they would soon cross. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, and the sound was swallowed by the silence that followed. Jack took another step forward. The basin was so quiet Jack could hear the faint rasp of his own breath. Heat shimmered between him and Cutter, the air heavy with the smell of smoke from the small fire. The man stood loose-limbed but ready, the long knife glinting in his hand. His eyes fixed on Jack with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world fall away. Jack took another step forward, the Colt low but ready. Behind him, the red hollow men shifted uneasily, their boots scraping the dry earth. They were waiting for his signal, but Jack didn't give it, not yet. Cutter wanted him to move first, to commit, to give him something to counter. The hawk's cry came again, high and sharp, and Cutter's mouth curved into that slow, dangerous smile. "You've been chasing me all night," he said, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "Now you've found me. Let's see if you can keep me." Jack didn't answer. He closed the distance by another 2 paces, his boots crunching on the grit. Cutter's men were out there. He could feel them, hidden among the rocks and scrub, waiting for the moment to spring. This wasn't just a duel. It was bait. The first movement was almost too fast to see, a flicker of motion to Jack's right, the glint of a rifle barrel. He dropped to one knee as the shot cracked, the bullet whining past his ear. His Colt came up and barked once, the shooter tumbling from behind a boulder. Then the basin erupted. Gunfire tore through the stillness, echoing off the stone walls. Jack's men scrambled for cover, returning fire in sharp bursts. Cutter didn't flinch. He came forward through the chaos, the knife flashing as he closed the gap. Jack fired, the shot grazing Cutter's coat, but the man kept coming, his boots pounding the dirt. They met in a collision of muscle and grit, Jack's shoulder slamming into Cutter's chest. The knife slashed, catching Jack's sleeve and slicing a shallow line along his arm. Pain flared hot, but Jack drove forward, forcing Cutter back a step, round them. The fight was a blur, muzzle flashes in the shadows, the shouts of men, the thud of boots on hard ground. Jack caught a glimpse of one of his own going down, another dragging him toward cover. Cutter used the distraction, twisting free and circling to Jack's left. Jack pivoted, keeping him in sight. The man's grin hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. "You're better than I thought," Cutter said, his voice low enough that only Jack could hear. "That makes this more fun." Jack lunged, aiming to knock the knife away, but Cutter slipped aside. the blade slicing the air where Jack's ribs had been a heartbeat before. They traded blows in the dust, each strike met with a counter, each feint answered in kind. A shout from the ridge cut through the noise, one of Cutter's men calling for a retreat. Jack's eyes flicked toward the sound, just for an instant, and Cutter moved. The knife came in low, forcing Jack to twist hard to avoid it. They locked again, breath ragged, muscles straining. Then Cutter shoved him back and stepped away, the knife still in his hand. "Not tonight," he said, and whistled sharply. From the shadows, horses appeared, riders swinging into the saddle. Gunfire covered their withdrawal, the sound fading as they pounded toward the far side of the basin. Cutter backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Jack's, that same smile still carved into his face, and then he was gone, swallowed by the heat-hazed horizon. Jack stood in the settling dust, chest heaving, the Colt still warm in his grip. Around him, the Red Hollow men emerged from cover, counting the wounded, scanning the ridges for any sign of return. He knew they wouldn't see Cutter again today, but the man had left his mark, not just in the cut on Jack's arm, but in the way he'd fought, the way he'd chosen to leave. This wasn't over. Cutter wasn't running. He was leading Jack somewhere. And Jack, bleeding and unshaken, was going to follow. The basin lay behind them, a smear of dust and heat on the horizon, but Jack could still feel it in his bones, the weight of Cutter's stare, the promise in that smile. The Red Hollow men rode in a loose line, their horses picking their way over the uneven ground, the silence between them heavy. No one asked if they were turning back. They all knew they weren't. Cutter's trail was easy to follow at first. Hoofprints cut deep into the dry earth, the occasional scuff of a boot where a rider had dismounted. But as the land began to rise into low, broken hills, the signs grew fainter. Jack slowed his horse, scanning the ground, the ridges, the sky. Cutter was leading them somewhere, and he was making sure they knew it. By midday, the sun was a white hammer overhead, the heat shimmering off the rocks. They passed through a narrow defile where the wind funneled hot and dry, carrying the faint smell of mesquite smoke. Jack reined in, raising a hand for the others to stop. The smell was fresh. Cutter was close. They dismounted, leading the horses into the shadow of a bluff. Jack moved ahead on foot, every step measured, his eyes flicking from the ground to the ridgelines. A hawk wheeled high above, its shadow sliding over the rocks. Somewhere ahead, a stone shifted, not the wind, not an animal. He signaled, and the men fanned out, rifles ready. The trail dipped into a shallow arroyo, its floor littered with boulders and scrub. Jack crouched behind a rock, peering over the edge. At first, he saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement, a man slipping between the boulders, the sun catching the barrel of his rifle. Jack's pulse slowed, his focus narrowing. Cutter had posted sentries. That meant the main camp was near. He eased back, whispering to the nearest man to circle wide and cut off any escape. They moved like shadows, the only sound the crunch of grit under their boots. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that sent chips of stone stinging Jack's cheek. He dropped flat, returning fire toward the flash of movement. Shouts rang out, echoing off the arroyo walls, and suddenly the air was thick with gunfire. Jack slid into cover, the smell of powder sharp in his nose. He could hear the others firing, the thud of bullets into rock and dirt. A man's voice called out, not Cutter's, but close, barking orders to hold them here. Jack realized then that this wasn't the camp. This was another screen, another layer in Cutter's game. He moved low, darting from rock to rock, closing the distance to the sentry's position. A shadow shifted ahead, and Jack came up fast, the Colt barking once. The man went down, his rifle clattering against the stone. The gunfire began to fade, the remaining sentries melting away into the rocks. Jack didn't chase. He knew better than to run headlong into whatever Cutter had waiting. Instead, he gathered the men, checking for wounds, to hit, one bad enough to need a stretcher. They pressed on, slower now, the land growing wilder, the gullies deeper. The sun slid west, throwing long shadows across the ground. Jack felt the pull of it, the sense that they were being drawn into a place where the rules shifted, where Cutter's hand was on every stone and shadow. When they finally crested the last rise, the sight stopped them cold. Below, in a wide, hidden valley, A cluster of tents and corrals sprawled in the fading light. Horses moved restlessly in the enclosures, and men walked between the fires, their rifles slung easy but close to hand. And there, at the center, Cutter stood beside a black horse, speaking to a man Jack didn't recognize, tall, lean, with a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Even from this distance, Jack could feel the weight of that man's presence. Whoever he was, Cutter was listening to him. Jack's jaw tightened. This wasn't just Cutter's fight anymore. Something bigger was moving in the shadows of the west, and he'd just stepped into the middle of it. He turned to the men beside him, their faces drawn and wary in the dying light. "We wait for dark," he said. "Then we go," and the wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant laughter from the valley below. Jack felt it settle in his bones, the knowledge that the night ahead would change everything, and that Cutter wasn't the only enemy waiting in the dark. Night fell like a curtain over the hidden valley, the fires below flickering against the dark. Jack lay on his stomach at the ridge's edge, the cold rock pressing into his ribs, eyes fixed on the camp. Cutter moved easily among his men, but it was the tall stranger beside him who held Jack's attention. Even in the shifting firelight, the man's presence was unmistakable, calm, deliberate. The kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted. Jack had seen men like him before. Not outlaws, not lawmen, something in between. The kind who could pull strings from the shadows and never get their hands dirty. Whoever he was, Cutter deferred to him, and that meant this fight was bigger than Jack had thought. The Red Hollow men waited behind him, crouched low among the rocks. They were tired, scraped raw by days of pursuit, but their eyes were steady. Jack gave the signal, and they began to move, slipping down the slope in silence, the wind covering the faint crunch of boots on gravel. They reached the edge of the camp before the first alarm was raised. A shout split the night, and then the valley erupted, men scrambling for rifles, horses screaming in their pens, the sharp crack of gunfire tearing through the dark. Jack moved fast, weaving between tents, his colt barking in short, controlled bursts. Cutter appeared through the chaos, the long knife in his hand catching the firelight. "You should have stayed in Red Hollow," he called, his voice carrying over the din. Jack didn't answer. He closed the distance, their boots churning up dust, the sounds of the fight fading into a dull roar in his ears. Cutter swung, the blade slicing the air, but Jack caught his wrist, driving a fist into his ribs. The man grunted, twisting free, and they circled each other in the glow of the burning tents. The stranger watched from the shadows, unmoving, as if weighing the outcome. Cutter lunged again, and this time Jack didn't give ground. They crashed together, the knife skittering away into the dirt. Jack's fist caught Cutter's jaw, snapping his head back, but the man came on, relentless. They traded blows, each strike harder than the last, until Jack saw the opening. A half step too far, Cutter's guard down for just an instant. Jack drove him back, the Colt in his hand now, the barrel steady. Cutter froze, chest heaving, eyes locked on Jack's. For a moment, neither moved. Then the stranger's voice cut through the night. Enough. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The gunfire faltered, men turning toward the sound. The stranger stepped forward, his face still shadowed by the brim of his hat. "This isn't your fight anymore, Cutter," he said. "It's mine." Jack felt the shift in the air, the way Cutter's jaw tightened, the way the men around them seemed to lean toward the stranger without thinking. Whoever this man was, he had just taken the reins. Cutter's eyes flicked to Jack, something unreadable passing between them. Then he stepped back, melting into the crowd, leaving Jack facing the stranger alone. The man smiled, slow and deliberate. "You've made quite a mess, Rourke. Let's see how you handle the rest of it." And then, as quickly as it had begun, the camp was pulling away, men mounting up, fires doused, the sound of hooves fading into the dark. The stranger didn't look back. Jack stood in the settling dust, the Colt still warm in his hand, knowing this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something larger, something that would reach far beyond Red Hollow. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and the faint echo of hoof beats. Jack holstered his gun, his eyes on the horizon. Whatever game the stranger was playing, he was in it now, and he intended to win.